Hello everyone, I'm Michael Douglas, and welcome to another edition of Dr. Pundit, where we talk about music, not medicine. And on this edition of the show, we've got another great album review, and it's one of my damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of guilty pleasure albums from the 1980s. The album Raised on Radio by Journey, their last formal 80s album before they kind of unofficially broke up. And it's an album I've always wanted to review for a long time. I think now's as good a time as any. Well, let's just get into it. And while this album doesn't exactly capture the magic that Journey was truly capable of producing on previous works such as Escape and the classic 1983 album Frontiers, it's still a pretty good album. And most people, I think, who listen to this album, especially Journey fans, have mixed feelings about this album. Some people really enjoy it, while others are not so into it. But I don't blame people for feeling ambivalent about this album, because something about it doesn't exactly feel like it's Journey, but other elements fit right in with their ethos. It's largely considered by critics as being somewhat of a disappointment, probably because of Steve Perry's urge to take a more controlling type of tack over where Journey was going after their brief 2-year hiatus following the Frontiers concert tour. Now, he felt that using the latest in music technology and streamlining their sound to a more keyboard-oriented pop sound was a need in order to make another successful Journey album, and I don't fault him for that. A lot of arena rock bands were really doing that in the mid to late 80s, and this album was released in 1985. Now, a few examples include REO Speedwagon's Life as We Know It, and Queen's A Kind of Magic from the mid-1980s. Journey was simply following this trend, believing it was key to producing another hit record, but in the end, that didn't have to be the case. And even today, when music critics take a look back at it, all it did was make the song sound sort of bland, which is why most arena rock bands' late 80s work is sometimes shunned and overlooked. Now, generally, Raised on Radio is a decent album, like I said, but it's not as good as Journey's older works because it sort of fails to bring that joyful and notorious sound that made the band who they were from the late 1970s and early 1980s. And before we get into my formal review and some of the discussion on their tracks, here is the track listing. Girl Can't Help It, Positive Touch, Suzanne, Be Good to Yourself, Once You Love Somebody, Happy to Give, Raised on Radio, I'll Be All Right Without You, It Could Have Been You, The Eyes of a Woman, Why Can't This Night Go On Forever? Following the release of Frontiers in 1983 and the subsequent promotional tour, the members of Journey decided to take a sabbatical. During the interim period, a couple of unreleased tracks from Frontiers surfaced on soundtrack albums, and solo albums were recorded by some of the band members, and when they reconvened, musical differences soon resurfaced, which resulted in bass players Ross Valory and drummer Steve Smith being fired from the band. If anything, this album is indicative of a lot of personnel changes and trouble with the band. Valory left prior to recording the album starting, but Smith remained long enough to appear on a couple of songs, and the two were not replaced immediately. The rhythm section of this album was being formed by session musicians, and I think that's kind of unfortunate. And while songwriting duties are once again shared by Jonathan Cain, Steve Perry, and Neil Schon, it's Perry who, of course, is the dominant force on Raised on Radio. He appears to have been the decision maker during the entire recording, the album being the follow-up to his solo work, Street Talk, the classic 1983-84 album. And while there's perhaps a tinge of disappointment this time around with a lack of any progression, this is nonetheless a pretty good collection of well-crafted songs. The best that they could do with the personnel changes of the album at the time. And generally more upbeat with less emphasis on ballads Raised on Radio is certainly radio friendly. Songs such as Suzanne and Girls' Names are usually a good bet for a hit, offer nothing radical or innovative on this album, but they do generally make for a good listening experience. Saxophone player Dan Hull provides fine sax to Positive Touch, giving the song a Hall & Oates jazzy feel, while the hit Be Good to Yourself ends with a welcome lead guitar break by Neal Schon. And on the ballad front, Happy to Give is a well-crafted, albeit standard adult contemporary type song from the 1980s. Perry once again showing that he unquestionably has one of the best voices in rock. And on the downside, there does appear to be rather more in the way of filler on this album, with songs such as Once You Love Somebody, it's a bit average. The Eyes of a Woman is a by the numbers, prosaic type of ballad. With Neal Schon's guitars on strangely muted form and vocalist Steve Perry taking a somewhat gentler approach, this album is very much Journey in a reflective, almost melancholic mood. And though the album also features the usual array of Journey trademarks, with the misty-eyed ballads, the up-tempo rockers, and slickly crafted pop songs, the group still is in check. And overall, there were 4 singles culled from this album, with Girl Can't Help It, Be Good to Yourself, I'll Be Alright Without You, and Suzanne, all reaching the top 20 of the Billboard charts. And one could argue, with a little more promotional heft, they could have had multiple top 10s on this album outside of Be Good to Yourself. Raised on Radio still failed to match previous efforts in spite of those hits, possibly due to the newish direction the group were trying to take. And as a result, it would prove to be the last kind of classic era Journey release before their return 11 years later with 1996's Trial by Fire, and the end of an era for the much maligned but hugely popular group. And although not in the same league as Escape, Look Into the Future, or even Infinity, this is a worthy end to the soft rock story of the 1980s and the genre's major exponents. All in all, Raised on Radio is a good but uninspired offering, and there generally is a feel of going through the motions on many of the tracks, but still they hold, and it can be a little irresistible to listen to them. Now, after its release and aborted promotional tour, Journey effectively broke up, and it would be the best part of a decade before any further original material, as I stated, emerged in the band's name. Still, Raised on Radio is a decent and fun AOR album that shouldn't displease too many Journey fans and represents the end of a period for a great American band. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about the songs before ending out this review, so let's get into that. Girl Can't Help It, again, a great kind of mid-tempo soft rock song to begin to close out Journey's work in the 1980s. It brings a slightly harder edge thanks to, again, Neal Schon's guitar. The song Positive Touch, now here is a funky song led by piano and the subtle pop and slap groove from the session musicians on the album. While it's one that I would normally skip when I do listen to this album, in so doing, I miss out on the cohesive aspect that the song brings to the album, again highlighting Neal Schon's guitar. Suzanne is probably the cheesiest song in the album, released, top 20 hit. The drums, the overpowering synthesized bass, the utterly banal lyrics. I'm a little bit ashamed to say that this is one of my favorite songs in a way on the album, and I suspect it's a combination of the vocal melody and Steve Perry's excellent performance that closes a gap for me. And whatever the case, sometimes I can't help myself when I listen to it. Of course, the lone top 10 hit, Be Good to Yourself. I used to listen to this song in the morning to start the day when it was really popular, probably like when I was in medical school. And that's probably all I'm going to say about it. Solid track. Once You Love Somebody is my least favorite song of the album, but it still has its own funky 1980s charm that pervades the album. Happy to Give. This song is the softest of the album, with a light synthetic instrumental and Perry's overwhelming, over-the-top vocals. The title track, Raised on Radio, it's funky 1980s rocker type stuff, nothing more, and I really don't care for this. It can be a little irritating, and I wish it really wasn't the title cut, but there you go. Of course, my favorite track, I'll Be Alright Without You. Smooth, velvety guitar lead, clean at first, a little bit gritty later, and an impeccable vocal performance once again by Steve Perry. Actually, I think one of Journey's best moments, and it's on this album, Raised on Radio. The song, It Could Have Been You, I find this to be probably the most forgettable track on the album. It's got a decent arrangement, but the corniness factor is a little too much because it affects the melody, I think, and the guitar tone is a little annoying. The Eyes of a Woman, another soft song on the album. This has some decent guitar work, and bassist Bob Globe even steps to the fore with some great moments. The final track, Why Can't This Night Go On Forever, makes for a gentle conclusion, perhaps trying to capture the success of Faithfully from the classic Frontiers album in 1983. And while this really didn't happen with this track, this is a song with quite a bit of power and finesse to it. Pop song for pop song, this is a good album and a decent album, but it's far removed from the classic rock, album rock, or even pop rock sound that this group had become famous for. And the way I see it, you can either look at this as a stunning Steve Perry album or a slightly disappointing Journey album. Some people might say it's Journey's last great album. The entire album does flow with the classic pop rock sound of this period, and Perry's production is great, although not as powerful as Frontiers, I think best album of the 80s by this band. But again, this is a strong album, and if you really like Journey, I think you should listen to it on a more regular basis. I probably listen to it once or twice a year. Well, there you have it, 1985, Raised on Radio. This album was released when I was a senior in high school. Probably that's why it's a little memorable to me in some respects. And it's yet another album review right here on Dr. Pundit. And if you like what you see and hear on this YouTube channel, please don't hesitate to like and subscribe. It allows me to keep giving this great content to you. And until next time, as the late great Barry White used to say, let the music play. And I'll see you on the next video.